Tonight, the deepening humanitarian disaster as Israel expands its ground assault and the death toll climbs in Gaza.
Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas.
The despair of the trapped.
Overwhelmed with the huge number of injured people.
The rescue of an Israeli soldier and the fears for other hostages.
We have a duty to bring them to safety.
A troubling new snapshot of Canada's unaffordable housing crisis.
Pest control issues, harassment by the landlords, illegal rent increases.
Rallying together for rental rights. Plus, friends pay tribute to Matthew Perry.
He was so caring and giving and wise.
The farewell message from his castmates on the hit show, and new details about his final hours.
CTV National News with Omar Sachedina.
Good evening, everyone. There are new fears of a widespread regional conflict erupting in the Middle East tonight as Israel intensified its ground assault into Gaza. Israel says that renewed push has led to the rescue of Private Ori Megidish, held hostage by Hamas, who today released new video of 3 women it says are part of the more than 200 Israelis Hamas is still holding captive. Today, Israel's prime minister once again rejected calls for a ceasefire. Benjamin Netanyahu, facing growing anger from the Israelis who accuse him of being unprepared for the October 7th Hamas attack, was asked today if he would consider resigning.
The only thing that I intend to have resign is Hamas. We're going to resign them to the dustbin of history.
That pledge is also deepening the despair for civilians in Gaza. This man's house destroyed. Israel says there's a safe haven in the south, but that's where it's also bombing. And the roads to get there are dangerous. Today, an Israeli tank fired on a car traveling on the main highway. Gaza's health ministry says more than 8,000 Palestinians have been killed, while Israel says the death toll from the October 7th Hamas attack is more than 1,400. CTV's Heather Wright starts us off.
Israeli forces are advancing deeper into Gaza with infantry on the ground and airplanes above. It was during one of these raids that Ori Megidish, an Israeli soldier captured on October 7th, was rescued. The soldier was medically checked, is doing well, and has met with her family, the army said in a brief statement. The announcement came just hours after Hamas released this video, showing 3 of the estimated 239 hostages being held captive in Gaza. The woman speaking in the video has been identified as Danielle Aloni, who was kidnapped from Kibbutz Nir Oz. When I saw the image of Danielle on TV, my heart almost stopped, her father said today, adding he felt relief to see her alive. Israel's prime minister called the video cruel psychological propaganda, vowing to stay the course in this war despite calls for a ceasefire.
Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. That will not happen.
The United Nations and medical staff warn Israeli airstrikes are hitting close to hospitals, where patients are being treated and thousands are taking shelter.
Overwhelmed with the huge number of injured people, as you see here.
The head of surgery at Gaza's largest hospital says staff simply cannot cope with the sheer volume of patients, while the number of Palestinians displaced inside Gaza continues to grow. In the occupied West Bank, more than 115 Palestinians have been killed since the war began. 4 more were laid to rest today, killed last night after fighting broke out between Israeli forces and Palestinians in Jenin. I asked what was happening, this man says, and they said the troops had invaded the area. Then I heard gunfire, bombs, and explosions. Israel says it carried out more airstrikes today against both Syria and Lebanon, taking out rocket launchers in Syria and Hezbollah targets in Lebanon as cross-border fighting heats up. Omar.
All right, Heather, thank you. Another stark image emerged from the conflict today. These are all cars damaged in Israel during the October 7th attacks by Hamas. A junkyard inside southern Israel is now home to more than 400 burnt vehicles. The total number destroyed is about 1,500. Israel's strikes inside Gaza have leveled entire neighborhoods, leading to calls for a ceasefire. But those calls aren't coming from the federal government. Here's CTV's Kevin Gallagher.
Ceasefire now! Pro-Palestinian protesters targeted the offices of federal politicians across the country, calling for a ceasefire.
Standing against mass violence is standing against collective punishment.
Some were arrested for trespassing at the Justice Minister's office.
Palestine will be free.
As demonstrators demand Canada hold Israel responsible for the more than 8,000 civilian deaths reported in Gaza.
This is not a matter of taking sides, but of addressing the fundamental rights and dignity of a people deserving of peace, liberation, prosperity, and most certainly worthy of life.
Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly again stopped short of calling for a ceasefire, instead asking for a humanitarian truce.
We must be guided by human dignity, and all civilians, Israeli and Palestinians, for they are equal, must be protected.
The issue is dividing Liberal MPs.
I'm a mother, and it is really very important that we ask for a ceasefire because innocent civilians are being killed.
They came here in order to...
These Israelis all have family members either murdered or kidnapped by Hamas.
This is my niece, Ofli. She visited us in Toronto this summer.
They're demanding Canada do more to secure their release.
There are kids there that saw how their parents are butchered in front of their eyes. The whole world needs to deal with this as a top priority. A top priority. So I think that Canada hasn't done enough yet.
Melanie Joly says Canada is advocating for the release of hostages and for a humanitarian corridor to allow the 400 Canadians still in Gaza a path to safety. Omar?
All right, Kevin, thank you. Hours into a strike by more than 8,000 Stellantis auto workers, their union revealed today they reached a deal with the automaker.
This agreement will considerably improve the living standards of every single uniform member at Stellantis in Canada.
The new deal, which still needs to be ratified, follows similar agreements with GM and Ford, including wage increases, cost of living allowance, and improved pensions. And cargo is once again moving along the St. Lawrence Seaway after a tentative deal was reached on Sunday, ending an 8-day strike by 360 workers. It could take a week to clear the backlog. Clearing Canada's housing crisis will take much longer. CTV's Annie Bergeron-Oliver on the fresh anger and new fears.
They dealt with bed bugs, cockroaches, mice, peeling paint.
Armed with hundreds of tenant testimonies,
Housing is right.
Housing advocates marched into the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, seeking help for renters struggling with rising costs.
We're trying to get some new affordable housing in place, stuff that's not market value, so that people can actually have a chance to afford the places that they live instead of being driven out.
Rental rates have skyrocketed in recent years. The price of a one-bedroom in Toronto is now $2,100 a month, up from $1,600 in 2019. In Vancouver, it's $2,700 compared to $1,600 in 2019. And in Ottawa, it's $1,700, up from $1,300. Alec McDonald lives on a fixed income and says he can't afford to move.
It would be almost impossible. And it would be impossible as the rent increases every year thereafter.
A big part of the housing crunch is high demand with a lack of supply. To help, the City of Ottawa and the federal government are looking at turning unused office buildings into apartments. Some of the best buildings to do that are these aging, brutalist-style post-war buildings that are often empty and in need of repairs. This expert says these kinds of conversions can often save time and money.
Having seen office conversions in Ottawa and other cities, we know that this is a possibility, and with the need for more housing, this is both an opportunity to reuse the buildings as they exist, but it's also an opportunity to bring new people to our downtown.
Under pressure to curb the housing crisis, the federal government has created a multi-billion-dollar housing accelerator fund to fast-track at least 100,000 new homes. It's also removed the GST on new rental construction. But still, the CMHC says more needs to be done.
There is a need for 3.5 million additional housing starts than are currently planned for in the next 10-year horizon.
Changes that would help Canada meet a demand for housing that's only going to grow. Annie Bergeron-Oliver, CTV News, Ottawa.
More than 1,000 students, staff, and faculty from Quebec's 3 English universities marched through Montreal. Tuition is set to nearly double from almost $9,000 to $17,000 for out-of-province students starting next fall. Students say they refuse to give up until the province reverses course. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe vowed to stop collecting the federal carbon tax in his province if Ottawa isn't willing to offer the same break on home heating costs as it announced last week for Atlantic provinces.
We will take action in Saskatchewan where Sask Energy will terminate, they will quit collecting the carbon tax on January the 1st. And really what this is, it's about fairness for families, for Canadian families, regardless of where you live in the nation.
Next door in Alberta, today's throne speech also exposed provincial friction with the feds. CTV's Alberta Bureau Chief Bill Fortier reports.
What started with ceremony quickly turned to acrimony.
There are powerful forces in our country, including in the federal government.
The Alberta throne speech taking jabs at Ottawa's proposed emissions caps and a 2035 target for a net zero electrical grid.
Alberta's government will not permit the federal government to inflict these destructive policies.
The speech is normally a broad preview of a new session. This time it included specific threats to use Alberta's controversial Sovereignty Act for the first time, a legislative tool to ignore federal directives the province believes are unconstitutional, while the two sides fight it out in court.
Some really fiery language towards the federal government. They don't mention Trudeau by name, but it's pretty powerful.
It's the latest sign of the bitterness between the provincial and federal governments. The Liberals recently announced a carbon tax break for heating oil used primarily in Atlantic Canada. Pushed on that regional inequity in an interview for CTV's Question Period, the Rural Economic Development Minister said this.
Atlantic Caucus was vocal with what they've heard from their constituents, and perhaps they need to elect more Liberals on the prairies.
She's got it exactly wrong. What they need to do is elect a common-sense Conservative government.
Back in Alberta, the throne speech included a bill that would make it illegal to raise or introduce new taxes without a referendum. One key issue noticeably missing, the province's proposal to scrap the CPP in favor of an Alberta pension plan.
Is this a sign, a subliminal sign, that there may be some sort of backtracking?
Also in today's speech, some bold projections for Alberta's population growth approaching 10 million people by 2050. StatsCan has forecast much lower. Even the province's own numbers from just 4 months ago project around 7 million Albertans by then. Omar.
All right, Bill, thanks. Another popular app has been barred on government phones. Chinese messaging app WeChat has been barred because it, quote, poses an unacceptable level of risk to security. This follows a ban on Chinese-owned TikTok in February and another ban on China's Huawei from having their equipment installed on Canadian high-speed 5G networks. Today's ban also includes Kaspersky, a Russian-based antivirus app. Neck guards will be mandatory in England as of next year following the tragic death of a former NHL player over the weekend. Today, a high-profile push to make them mandatory here at all levels of hockey. CTV's Raheem Ladhani reports.
Inside the Ford Performance Center in Etobicoke, only 7-year-old James Jurassic is wearing a neck guard during this open skate.
I can keep my neck safe.
While they are mandatory during games in minor and women's hockey, his father John plans to take it a step further.
As he gets older, I would get him even more padded one, more protective one.
Player protection has come into the spotlight after over the weekend Adam Johnson, an ice hockey player in England, died after suffering a cut to his neck by a skate blade during a game. Players and fans of the Nottingham Panthers laid flowers for the 29-year-old outside the arena. Earlier in his career, Johnson played 13 games with the Pittsburgh Penguins in the NHL, a league where neck guards are not mandatory. Among the many tributes pouring in for Johnson is one from Hayley Wickenheiser, a 4-time Olympic women's gold medalist and the assistant general manager for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Wickenheiser wrote on social media, "I know it may not pass the cool factor, but it's time for mandatory neck protection at every level in hockey. The risk is far too great." Back inside the arena, players are split.
I think it should be mandatory. They're professionals and there's risks they take, but
I would think that it probably would be individual choice still because of performance levels and so on.
There have been a handful of incidents in the NHL where a skate blade has made contact with a player's neck, resulting in serious injuries, and many around the league believe that in the coming days there will be more discussions about increased player safety. Raheem Ladani, CTV News, Toronto.
Coming up.
Addiction doesn't care what your background is. It doesn't care how much money you make.
Remembering the friend who shattered the stigma of addiction. A dramatic jump in the death toll from Hurricane Otis in Mexico, where nearly 100 people are now believed to be dead or missing. The Category 5 storm slammed into Acapulco last week, and today confirmation a Canadian who was living there is among the victims. At least 220,000 homes have been destroyed. New details on the death of Matthew Perry. His assistant was the one to call 911 after finding him unresponsive. Tonight, in a joint statement, the cast of Friends wrote, "We were more than just castmates. We are family." CTV's Geneviève Beauchemin on the cause he championed behind the scenes.
I'm not great at the advice. Can I interest you in a sarcastic comment?
That one-liner, a show of Matthew Perry's self-deprecating humor. But today, a chorus of voices said off-screen, the friend to so many did have powerful, wise words and experience to offer. In his disarmingly frank memoir, Perry wrote of his ferocious battle against what he called the big, terrible thing.
55 Viking in a day, which is where I was.
55.
I was taken aboard that hat.
He wrote of his 15 stints in rehab, his days drunk, high, or hungover on set, his colon exploding in 2019.
Drinkers think they're trying to escape.
Perry said that with fame came responsibility, and by speaking out, he hoped to help others. Hank Azaria posted a tribute saying Perry took him to his first AA meeting.
He was so caring and giving and wise, and he totally helped me get sober.
He also had an impact on others further from the spotlight.
I've broken way too many hearts, and
Stephen Norn says he's dodged death several times over his more than 2 decades-long struggle with addiction. Perry's sudden death, an eye-opening reminder to him.
this thing is an unforgiving beast, Addiction doesn't care what your background is. It doesn't care how much money you make.
Experts say 1 in 10 Canadians has a formal addictive disorder, and less than 1 in 10 of those receive treatment.
Stigmatization prevents people from seeking treatment that they need. Stigmatization prevents people from having conversations that need to be had.
Yes, he was some guy.
In death, Perry has sparked some of those conversations. Perry's cause of death is still unknown. Toxicology test results could take weeks, but helping others battling addiction will long be part of his legacy. Geneviève Beauchemin, CTV News, Montreal.
Still ahead, Between the Lines, the harsh reality buried in a best-selling work of science fiction. A thrilling sequel about a global apocalypse sounds like a summer blockbuster, but it also describes a best-selling new book looking at a science fiction scenario through the eyes of an Indigenous community. On tonight's Indigenous Circle, CTV's Donna Sound speaks to the author.
The rippling water around the small boat bounced jewels of light back up towards the sky.
A birth, a new life, a renewal is how journalist turned best-selling author Wabgijik Rice begins his newest novel, Moon of the Turning Leaves.
You can take a little more time with a story like this. Right?
It's a fictional apocalyptic tale. However, details of the Anishinaabe traditions and the way of life on reserve are true.
Many people are familiar now with the Indian Act and the past system that forbade people from leaving their communities, essentially making them open-air prisons.
Rice is from Wasauksing First Nation near Parry Sound, Ontario, and is credited as one of the Indigenous authors putting a new spin on science fiction and horror.
I really wanted to offer a glimpse of the renewal that's possible after the end of the world in the first book.
In that book, the power goes out, as it did in 2003, only this time it doesn't come back on. His First Nations characters are uniquely prepared to endure the catastrophe because of their current living conditions, which include boil water advisories and living apart in fly-in communities.
What they're able to do after the collapse is really focus on themselves as a community, their place on the land, and really their freedom to move forward as an Anishinaabe, because they're not oppressed by the state anymore because it doesn't exist anymore.
What was your experience like?
When everything falls away, we still have our relationship with the land, which has been nurtured by a lot of our communities since time immemorial.
Apocalyptic scenes on the page, making a point for the real world. Donna Sound, CTV News, Toronto.
A big surprise today for students on the Enoch Cree Nation in Alberta. The Stanley Cup was brought to their school a day after the NHL's Heritage Classic outdoor game in Edmonton.
We're screaming. We're excited. I was excited.
The students also heard from former pro hockey player Brent Dodginghorse, who encouraged them to chase their dreams. Important message after the break. The team taking on graffiti and bristling with energy. Young entrepreneurs in St. John's have started a business to tackle a problem that's so bad. Police have even launched a tip line to track down the offenders. CTV's Garrett Barry explains.
So we got enough. Yeah, we do. This city's battle with graffiti just got some new allies. 18-year-old Jacob and 15-year-old Jack.
The first coat loosens it up a good bit.
Call them the Scrub Squad.
I just want to see that there's color coming from that to my paintbrush.
They've got the gear, and since the start of this summer, they've been honing their new craft.
Throw the chemical on, agitate it, blast it away, and you have a clean surface. It's pleasing to look at, it is.
But this isn't just some routine summer job. Graffiti's been vexing police and business owners all year in this city, leading to investigations, arrests, even a tip line.
We started seeing more and more news articles, people complaining on social media, everything like that. We generally think it's just a benefit to the community, and we take satisfaction in doing it.
The next challenge for Jack, managing all this with his homework.
There's 24 hours in a day, right? So if 6 are in school, I still have a lot in a day. You know what I mean? I can go to bed, wake up before I go to school, do emails, make Facebook posts, everything like that.
But with a good team, some time, and a good blast of water,
we're always keeping each other on track, like being liable for each other pretty much. We've just been really good friends lately and business partners as well.
These young men see themselves going far.
I think that our company is going to grow a lot over the next year or so.
Garrett Barry, CTV News, St. John's.
And that's a snapshot of this Monday for all of us at CTV National News. See you tomorrow. Good night.